Hello all. And so building on the discussion or continuing with metaphysics and philosophy of language, I wanted to start again with Nelson Goodman and the theoretical worlds. Of course, with him and art, we saw where there's world creation within the physical world that we inhabit. Of course, with Heidegger, that's re-territorializing these earthly symbols, these earthly like entities, to use the terminology here. And so, what would it be then to look beyond just aesthetic symbolism and the pragmatism of empirical values with regards to scientific theories and their frameworks? What if possible worlds then and possibilities that could be logically brought upon with regards to events not happening or actualized in our particular world? What of other universes or other worlds out there where certain historical events could go in a different direction, or certain properties or characteristics could be different in a logically theoretical way. And so, among logical objects, as we've been talking about, there are possibilities of other worlds. And so you can really see through here in the 20th century, the contemporary influence towards, concepts like a multiverse where, characters, in a sort of canonized way, or a straight path of storytelling could have possibilities that weren't actualized perhaps in that particular representation, but theoretically could have had a different influence. And so we see with the rise of the multiverse, as it's called, certainly with Hollywood constantly rehashing these same character concepts, and to a degree to stagnation, as many would complain. And so you can see here perhaps there's that tracing through this opening up of logical possibilities when discussing ontological entities. And so things could be other than they are by possibilities or in its language hypothetical usage. And so the language of possible worlds then has perhaps its own ontology. And so for Nelson Goodman, in his particular take towards possible world ontology, and he's following in that same Quine tradition of trying to form logic without ontology, so you can anticipate his stance here. And so the logic with entities is self-structuring. Goodman sees the language of possible worlds really as just semantics and a linguistic trick. Possible worlds and hypotheticals are ultimately built out from the empirical input of logical entities, but these are just hypotheticals, and so it's really just a concern of a hypothesis or a hypothetical statement of what this world might have been or what might yet to be. And so it's just simply the empirical hypothesis, and there's nothing beyond that. So as we can see with Nelson Goodman here, we're dealing with anti-realism in possible world ontology. Now, of course, other thinkers are going to contribute to this discussion here, and certainly that is with D.K. Lewis, who is an English philosopher, and he is not convinced that these are just simply hypothetical statements of this possible world. It's reductionary to statements of this particular world. And so D.K. Lewis speaks of counterfactual statements. And so the logic of counterfactuals, can counterfactuals be adequately explained as empirical hypothesis of this world? And if not hypothetical, then we must admit that there is an objectiveness to logical entities. We would have to have a realist perspective of logical entities that are simply unactualized. So logical entities of a specific sort that hasn't been actualized are counterfactuals that cannot be reduced without remainder. And so he's saying, if we're going to be a realist of possible worlds, then you have to be a realist about logical entities. And so there's an interesting way of seeing his counterfactuals of these possible worlds then that do not have a sort of interwovenness and an interaction between what an entity in this world might be as compared to an entity in another world. And you can see here the sort of tracing of monadology with Leibniz in his descriptions of how the monad is windowless and is the building block that has no real causal mechanism of each other. And so this really works in a similar way to how possible worlds are for Lewis. And so when it comes to counterfactuals, we have to discern really what an identity would be like, or what it would look like to retain such an identity in a different possible world than what is actualized in our world. And so this opens up that discussion through the counterfactuals of transworld identity. And so in the example of someone like Socrates, and how Nietzsche spent a great deal of effort in pointing out why Socrates thought and acted the way he did, through his things such as his physiognomy, as it were. Of course, he would say that about anyone really, but with Socrates, then is it possible to still be Socrates without these features that Nietzsche pointed out? And so what constitutes the same Socrates then if you were to remove those features? Is he still Socrates, or as you tweak these properties perhaps in identification of what your identity could possibly be in another world, what is his essence then? Is it his essence to have such a physiognomy? And so if not, then this kind of tacitly admits about logical entities or identities of an essence, and the essence of that quality. And so Lewis here is, of course, focusing on that translation of what these essences and what these entities would be like in the translation from one possible world to another. And to answer this with his look at the counterpart theory, our identity inhabits this world, but possible other worlds have counterparts to who you are. So, there's perhaps a counter world, where I would be but instead of just being a different entity that wasn't a philosopher, that was like a mechanic or something like that. Lewis would say that instead of thinking of me as just a different identity, doing this different job, as actually a counterpart instead. And so this once again kind of wraps around to the original video with regards to essences and universals of how one's identity would look like across many different worlds. And so, of course, there's going to be a lot of theological implications and discussions to come out of this with possible world ontology. And so Alvin Plantinga puts forth of a logical possible of God necessarily existing, because of course for many skeptics with regards to things like fine-tuning, of course, the classic harmonious theistic argument of this particular world where things and properties within the universe went a certain way to where Earth could be inhabited in such a way, ultimately making beings such as ourselves, who we are, intelligently put into the world, and obviously required a creator to put that forth. And of course, for the secular and skeptic argument is that this just happened to be the world where this sort of Leibniz, perfect possibility, if you will, or possibles. And so, to counter that, Plantinga, or at least many of the theists in today's world who is, refudiated to that fine-tuning argument, Plantinga isn't, trying to show a sort of evidential perspective on this particular world having God reveal himself in it, but he is saying that using this same sort of argumentation here, then there is a possibility that God would reveal himself to a possible world, that this necessarily can logically be asked upon. And so he's removing the objection of God, such as the classic atheist dictionary meaning, where there's the disbelief, the refutation that God exists, and he's removing that objection by pointing to the possibility of God's existence. And so this negates the possibility it can be refuted, of course, since it is a logical possible. But of course, then in opening up this, then we have to discuss, what is, God's sort of intention, what is God's intrinsic essence, if he was bounded to, what, many possible worlds could be. And if he's actualized, in that creation, and so, what is, God's intention, in the language perspective of his essence. And so, for Plantinga, God's essence means, that there are some things God cannot do, and God cannot be not God if God is God. And so this, of course, is getting at what the intentions, perhaps, of what God as being an ultimate creator is. If he's just this entity, which we seem to see so often in contemporary times, of God really having just this sort of symbolic functionality, as it seems to be, definitely with the internet scene and the sort of theory subculture here. many in the theological discourse talk of the necessity of the good life in accordance to obeying a religion, but not in particular of the sort of intimacy of actually serving a higher being, or self-actualizing with the commonality of the ultimate being and me being a descendant upon that being. And this is really getting at is God just an entity, and if so, then what of his properties then? And you kind of see this in contemporary talks within God language of well, if God is all powerful, then why would this be? If God believed in this, then why would such an event happen? This is certainly used against theists often. But of course, here then we're talking about God not being an arbitrary assigned entity, because simply put, then if God is just an external, then then what is the actual intention of that? What actually comprises of him then? And so, of course, if he has intentional meaning, then of course he has an essence, and as such he cannot not be that essence. And so this, of course, ties into the theistic interpretation of the incarnation. And so God as ultimate creator, subjugating himself to being and not being as such, of putting himself into the degree of a shared essence of to be, which of course is to say then, if the categories of being in that metaphysical tradition, then we should be able to apply such laws of logic across possible worlds towards a creator, and as such know his essence and know his value, because the piece of essence of being in the world is shared, of course, through the incarnation. And so, this was just a quick metaphysical discussion on the insights of ontology and language. Of course, this really recaps the demise of metaphysics through the 20th century and the reopening of it. And then, of course, in today's world, where it seems the 20th century was about the presupposition of God's death, really, and really just the second half as just this sort of acceptance of God being a sort of vacancy. And you see this resurrection of the necessity of God. And certainly in this century, it seems to be about a sort of revitalization of that theistic traditions, or at least rehashing them after modernity or the Enlightenment project. And perhaps there's a commentary to be said about us subjugating ourselves away from the being of beings in the Heideggerian sense of the categories of being obscuring away from us, because we have turned away from such logic, or even belief of such logic. And so that perhaps is interesting to note, as logical positivism is broken down, softened away from its original standpoint, and then eventually reopened through philosophy of language here, and then moving forward, as we'll get into, with the continental tradition again with the ontology of event metaphysics that starts to rise out of this language philosophy, as we'll track that resurrection of metaphysical discussions in today's world. But I hope you guys enjoy, and make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and thanks for watching.